Hi, and welcome to Module 4, which is going to be all about assessment. So this is just a quick overview of some important concepts about assessment, and then in the next two videos, we upgraded to a 3-video set here for assessment. In the next 2 videos, we're going to talk about some of the specifics, different types of assessment, things like that, but this is just going to orient us to the topic. So goals and objectives. We're going to define some important terms: formative and summative assessment and authentic assessment. Then we're going to talk about what it means to have those aligned with your learning outcomes. So some of the things that we've been talking about in previous modules, we're going to come in here and think about how to get that whole process be aligned with one another so that our learning outcomes, everything that we're doing is working our way towards those learning outcomes. And then we're going to begin to think about assessment choices, which is going to be what we pick up in modules 2 and 3. So first question, does grading equal assessment? Assessment is sort of the fancy way of saying things we assign to students to see how they're doing. And thinking about grading, which is evaluating individual students' learning and performance. So it's a process of evaluating. Assessment is oriented a little bit more towards improving student learning. And sometimes those can go together, but they don't necessarily do the same thing. And so we're going to be talking much more about assessment, which is grading will come into play, but the idea of ranking people, right, putting them into grades and ranks is not our primary objective. A couple of resources here. So I want to talk about ungraded assessments, the process of ungrading in general. You may have heard this term. We'll talk about it a little bit in Module 2, but there's also some resources here, including a really great document that someone who participated in a previous pedagogy workshop put together during COVID about a panicked foray into ungrading, which I would really recommend. So, formative assessments. These are meant to be formative, right? They're meant to help develop students along the way. So these are things that are going to monitor learning. They're generally very low stakes. So things that are graded pass, fail, things that are kind of done, not done, where the grade is not so important. It helps students assess strengths and weaknesses. A big part of quizzes, for example, it's partly so I can see how students are doing, but it's partly also for students to see how students are doing. They may think that they really have a concept, but when they are asked to apply that concept without their tools, without resources, without a little bit of nudging from me, they may see where there are some problems in their understanding and where they can develop that further. And then again, it helps faculty recognize where students need more support. So the idea is not, oh no, you failed this quiz, but okay, I see that everyone needs a little more work on these verb forms. I'm going to adjust my teaching to respond to that. Summative assessments, these are things that are usually at the end of a class, and it's sort of how much did we meet our learning objectives? It's the kind of big picture end of the course stuff or end of unit stuff meant to evaluate learning. So it's not this monitoring learning, it's this kind of ongoing process, but it's much more about evaluating learning in a more final sense. These tend to be high stakes, a final paper, a final exam, something like that. And a lot of times these are comparing to benchmarks. And I'm not at all suggesting that summative assessments are bad. Formative assessments, I think, are a place where we don't spend enough time. But summative assessments, depending on the course, those can be really, really important. If your students need to pass some kind of important external exam at the end of a class, right, these are really important. So thinking about which ones are going to meet the needs of your class, your students at that particular point in the learning process. So some examples, right? So formative assessment, quizzes, low stakes quizzes. Discussions, reflections, summaries, self-assessments. We're going to talk about that in Module 3. Collaboration, right? So these are all things that are built or designed to build and to develop. Summative assessments, things like essays, papers, projects, final, a recitation, a presentation, a portfolio. These things that are really meant to evaluate what has happened over the course of that unit or that course. So I want to talk a little bit here about, this is moving into authentic assessments. And this is another thing that I really would encourage us to think a little bit about. By and large, authentic assessments are things that are grounded in actual application. So if you've ever heard a student ask when they're going to need to use this, right? These are oftentimes going to make more explicit how what we're learning applies to their lives in general. So typical tests, right, require correct responses. There's a right and a wrong. Is it A or is it C? Authentic tasks oftentimes are going to require a high quality product, a performance, a justification of solutions and counter to problems. So these are going to be things that are a little bit more grounded in application and really show that someone has synthesized that. And then the indicator of authenticity that you can think about here, right? Correctness is not the only criterion. Students must be able to justify their answers. So if we think about things where you get points for showing your work, right? That we're more concerned with the process, with the thinking, with all of that kind of stuff, as opposed to did you select the right answer? Typical tests, there's this idea must be unknown to the student in advance to be valid. We're going to keep that test super secret and no one's going to see it, so it'll be really a hard surprise test. Why? This is kind of an arbitrary construction of the classroom that we've all just continued to go with. But I want my students to know what I'm testing. I don't want it to be a surprise when they see things on the test. I actually, in post-test reflections, if I have my students do exam wrappers, which we'll be talking about a little bit later as well, I asked them, what were you unprepared for? What did you not see coming on this test? Partly because that suggests that I haven't taught them everything they need to know for the exam. And the tests and standards for judgment should be known or predictable. The idea that we want to catch students with super hard questions they didn't anticipate, why? That is not about learning. That is about something else. That is about, I don't know, sometimes feels like hazing, right? And then here, this idea that typical tests are disconnected from the real world and the kinds of constraints and conditions that students will see in the real world. Again, it creates this idea that the classroom is separate from the real world. That, I think, is something we really want to break down, that idea that there's some big wall between the classroom and the real world. So authentic tasks going to be tied to real world context and constraints. So if this is, you can see this very easy in something like an engineering course where, okay, let's apply this to an actual situation you could actually encounter and need to solve out in the world. But we can think about this in classic situations all the time. I have students write an op-ed about which text should be included in the high school English curriculum, right? How big a place should classical antiquity hold in a high school English curriculum, or a history curriculum, something like that, where it is in fact they are applying what we've talked about and arguments to the world outside of our classroom. And then the idea that the text and constraints are like those encountered by practitioners of the discipline, showing students what it is like to be a classicist. What it is like what kinds of things do we actually do instead of this sealed off, like hermetically sealed bubble of classics classroom. And then I want to point out that it's not like there are two columns and these things never intersect. Formative assessment and summative assessment overlap in lots of different ways. So something like a reflective journal, right? A reflection essay on a final project. Case studies, things like this. There are plenty of ways where these things are going to have elements of both. So it's not going to be the final paper that is everything in the whole class, but it's also going to be maybe wrapping up a unit or something where it is going to be somewhat summative, but still has a lot of formative. They're getting a lot of feedback and it's more designed at building along the course of the semester, even though in some ways it is summative. So these are not mutually exclusive categories by any means. And then alignment. So as with all things, we really want everything to be going in the same direction. So when we're doing something in class, we want it to be aimed at our learning objectives. So what do I want students to know how to do when they leave this course? What skills, what do I want to equip them with? Assessments, these are going to be what kind of tasks will reveal whether we are getting there. And so that's really that alignment thinking. And then strategies we'll talk about last. That'll be next week. What kinds of activities will reinforce those objectives and prepare students for assessment. So you can see how all of these are coming at our learning objectives. And I think that's something that's really important to remember, kind of keep an eye on the learning objectives. And I make those very clear to my students. I'm asking you to do this test because this is what I want you to get out of the class. This is what we agreed as a group that is important for us. for this class to do. That's why I'm having you take this quiz. It's not because I'm a monster. It's because I want to help make sure that we get to our learning objectives. So this is something we've shown before, but I just want to reinforce as we're getting to the assessment activity. This was a class that alignment that I did for a drama class, a theater class. So I want them to develop the skills necessary to discuss and develop evidence-based arguments about drama and multimodal texts. Okay, so assessment. What is that going to look like? Ungraded discussion-based assignments, creative assignments, short answer questions that students complete, and having them generate discussion questions. So these are going to be these were things that I wanted to largely be ungraded. So I want them to do it, but it's less about the quality and more about the process there. And then we'll talk about instructional activity, what gets us there. That'll be for next week. So reflection time. In your teaching journal or the Discord, are you using any authentic assessments in your classes? If so, what are they? If you're not, are there things that you would like to try? A lot of times for classics, it can feel a little bit less easily applicable. These authentic assessments seem a little bit harder to come by. But I would encourage you to take a few minutes and think about ways that they can. There, in fact, are a lot of really rich ways to think about those that overlap there. And then have you been using formative and summative assessments in your courses? And if these are new terms, does thinking about that difference help you to be more intentional? So kind of schematizing them into those two categories. Does that help? Does that offer us anything? So I look forward to seeing what you all have to say in the reflections.